In a small village in the Yucatan Peninsula, a woman grinds maize the same way her great-grandmother did, speaking a language her ancestors spoke when they built temples that scraped the jungle canopy. Her DNA carries genetic markers traced directly to the people who raised Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza. She is, by every meaningful measure, Mayan, and she represents one of the strangest archaeological paradoxes in history. The Mayan civilization didn't vanish. 7 million descendants still walk Mexico and Central America today. Their cities collapsed. Their people didn't. So what actually destroyed one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Western Hemisphere? Today we're decoding what sediment cores, abandoned murals, and modern genetic studies reveal about a collapse that unfolded in slow motion across 200 years. If you're fascinated by how DNA is rewriting ancient history, hit subscribe. We're decoding lost civilizations every week. The Mayan disappearance is the most misunderstood collapse in human history. For over a century, popular imagination has painted the Maya as a vanished people, swallowed by jungle, erased from the earth, leaving behind only stone temples reclaimed by vines. The truth is stranger and more unsettling. The civilization fell. The people never left. Today, an estimated 7 million people identify as Mayan, living throughout Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, parts of Honduras, and across Mexico, with the highest concentrations in the Yucatan Peninsula. These aren't distant descendants with a faint cultural memory of who their ancestors were. These are people who still speak Mayan languages, still farm using techniques inherited across thousands of years, still carry surnames that appear in classical era inscriptions. The numbers are staggering. In the Yucatan alone, somewhere between 750,000 and 1.2 million people speak a Maya language as their primary tongue. Mexico's National Institute of Geography and Informatics estimates that 60% of the Yucatan state's population speaks Mayan. In Guatemala, approximately 42% of the entire population identifies as being of Mayan descent. The number of people carrying Mayan surnames and ancestry across the region is roughly 3 times the number of active Mayan speakers, meaning the genetic and cultural footprint extends far beyond the linguistic one. This creates an archaeological paradox that researchers have wrestled with for decades. When a civilization collapses, you typically see one of a few patterns: conquest, where invaders replace the population; disease, where pathogens devastate communities and erase cultural continuity; mass migration, where populations relocate so completely that the original homeland becomes empty; or genocide, where deliberate destruction wipes out a people entirely. The Maya collapse fits none of these patterns. The Spanish didn't arrive until centuries after the major collapse. The diseases that later devastated indigenous populations across the Americas weren't present during the classical era abandonment. There was no mass relocation to a new homeland, and the people, demonstrably, were not exterminated. So what actually happened? How does a civilization collapse so thoroughly that cities are abandoned mid-construction with half-finished murals still visible on temple walls, while the people who built those temples continue speaking the same language and farming the same valleys 1,200 years later? This is the question that has driven generations of archaeologists, climatologists, and now geneticists to investigate the Maya collapse from every conceivable angle. And what they've uncovered is something far more interesting than any conspiracy theory or alien intervention narrative. The Maya didn't disappear because something killed them. The Maya cities collapsed because something destroyed the systems that made urban civilization possible in that environment. The people survived by abandoning the system that was failing them and returning to forms of life that had sustained their ancestors for thousands of years before the great cities ever rose. This distinction matters enormously. It means the collapse wasn't about the Maya as a people. It was about a specific way of organizing Mayan society, concentrated in massive urban centers, dependent on intensive agriculture, ruled by god kings who claimed divine authority over rainfall and harvest. When that system broke, the cities emptied. But the cultural foundation, the languages, the agricultural knowledge, the religious traditions, the genetic lineages, all of it persisted. The empty pyramids you see today aren't tombstones for a dead people. They're monuments to a discarded political system. To understand what actually destroyed that system, we have to first understand what the Maya built and why their civilization shouldn't have been possible in the first place. The first signs of Mayan civilization appear in the archaeological record around 1500 BCE in scattered settlements across what is now Guatemala, southern Mexico, and Belize. These weren't impressive sights. Small villages organized around the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, gradually developing irrigation and terracing systems that would eventually allow them to extract food from one of the most agriculturally challenging environments in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the prevailing scholarly view was that the Maya were essentially a derivative culture, that they borrowed their fundamental architectural, religious, and political concepts from the Olmecs, the so-called mother civilization of Mesoamerica. Then a husband and wife archaeological team named Dr. Takeshi Inomata and Dr. Daniela Triadan spent years excavating the ancient Mayan city of Ceibal. When they applied radiocarbon dating to the oldest structures they uncovered, they found something that overturned a century of assumptions. The earliest Ceibal structures predated the most ancient construction at the Olmec site of Venta by 200 years. The Maya weren't following the Olmecs. They were developing their own civilizational complexity in parallel, possibly even leading certain innovations. Many archaeologists now believe the rigid distinction between Olmec and Mayan cultures was always artificial, that multiple Mesoamerican societies developed simultaneously after the rise of maize agriculture, borrowing from and influencing each other in a continuous cultural exchange. What followed was extraordinary. The Mayan Golden Age, stretching from 250 CE to 900 CE, produced achievements that should have been impossible given the technological constraints of the era. Their astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with such precision that the El Caracol Observatory at Chichen Itza, a dome-shaped structure perched above the jungle canopy, was perfectly aligned with the planet's orbital cycles. Their mathematicians independently developed the concept of zero, centuries before it appeared in European mathematics. They constructed two simultaneous calendar systems, including the famous long count calendar that would later be misinterpreted by 21st century conspiracy theorists as predicting the apocalypse in 2012. The calendar predicted no such thing, but the misunderstanding obscured something more impressive. The Maya were tracking time in units extending millions of years into the past and future, demonstrating astronomical and mathematical sophistication that wouldn't be matched in much of the world for another 1,000 years. Then there was the writing. Maya hieroglyphics, developed between 200 BCE and 300 BCE, formed one of only a handful of fully developed writing systems independently invented in human history. It wasn't fully deciphered until the late 20th century, meaning generations of archaeologists worked at Maya sites without being able to read what was written on the walls around them. Today, only 4 Mayan codices survive, books written on paper made from wild fig trees and bound between jaguar skin covers. The rest, hundreds of volumes containing astronomical records, religious texts, historical chronicles, and practical knowledge accumulated across centuries, were systematically destroyed by Spanish colonizers who deemed them pagan and burned them. We know more about ancient Egyptian record-keeping than we know about Maya record-keeping, not because the Egyptians were more prolific, but because their books survived. The Maya cities themselves, Tikal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, Tulum, were not just population centers, but engineering achievements. Pyramids that doubled as astronomical instruments, plaster reservoirs that captured and stored rainwater, athletic fields where ritualized ball games served religious and political functions. This was a civilization operating at the edge of what was possible in pre-industrial Mesoamerica. And yet, for all this sophistication, none of their astronomers, none of their priests, none of their long count calendars predicted what was coming for them. The collapse didn't happen overnight. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions about the Maya disappearance. Popular accounts often describe the civilization vanishing suddenly, as if every Maya city emptied on the same day, but the archaeological record tells a more disturbing story. The collapse unfolded over more than a century, rolling across the Maya world like a slow wave, with different cities falling at different times for what appear to be related but locally specific reasons. The pattern began in earnest around 800 CE. The wealthy city of Cancun, centuries before the name would become associated with spring break tourism, was thriving. Archaeological evidence confirms it was a powerful Maya center until approximately 800 CE. The last intricately carved panel depicting its ruler has been dated to 795 CE. Then something catastrophic happened. Excavations have uncovered evidence of mass violence at the site, including 38 separate bodies showing signs of brutal trauma, all dating to roughly the same period. Whoever attacked Cancun massacred the royal family and buried them with their jewelry, suggesting the assault was about elimination rather than plunder. Then there's Bonamp, deeper in the Maya world. One of its buildings contains some of the most spectacular surviving murals from the classical period, depicting the local Ajah winning a glorious battle around 791 CE. The artwork is detailed, vibrant, masterfully composed. And then it stops. On one section of the wall, half-finished sketches remain visible to this day, the artist's planning lines still etched into plaster that was never painted. The painters were in the middle of their work when something happened. They put down their brushes. They never came back. Aguateca, in modern Guatemala, tells a similar story with an added detail that changes everything. Builders and artists were constructing a temple when the work abruptly ceased. Stone stelae had been smoothed and prepared for the elaborate carvings that defined Maya monumental architecture, but the carvings were never made. What makes Aguateca different is what archaeologists found in the years preceding the abandonment. The inhabitants had been building defensive structures, palisades, fortifications, walls that hadn't existed before. Something was coming, and the people of Aguateca knew it. Whether they fled before the threat arrived or were overrun in the middle of their preparations remains unclear, but the message in the stone is unmistakable. They felt the danger approaching. This pattern repeated across the Maya world. The collapse seemed to begin around the Pitex-Batun region and then spread northward across the Usumacinta River. Scribes stopped recording history. Artists stopped producing sculptures. Royal monuments dedicated to specific rulers ceased being commissioned. Construction projects were abandoned at every stage of completion, from foundations to nearly finished temples. The eerie consistency across hundreds of kilometers suggested that whatever was happening wasn't a localized disaster, it was systemic. But here's the detail that doesn't fit any simple invasion theory. While the cities emptied, the rural population didn't disappear with them. The countryside surrounding these abandoned urban centers continued to support human habitation. Villages persisted. Agricultural communities adapted. Whatever destroyed the cities was specifically destroying urban civilization, not the Mayan people themselves. The defensive fortifications at sites like Aguateca point to one piece of the answer. Warfare was clearly intensifying during this period, but warfare alone couldn't account for the geographic spread of the collapse, the consistency of the patterns, or the simultaneous failure of cities that had no obvious reason to fall together. Something larger was happening beneath the surface, and the answer was hiding at the bottom of a lake. For decades, the dominant theories about the Maya collapse focused on warfare, disease, or political revolution. None of these explanations fully accounted for the evidence. Wars don't typically cause hundreds of cities to collapse in coordinated waves across thousands of square kilometers. Disease doesn't usually spare rural populations while devastating urban centers. Political revolutions don't normally produce a complete cessation of monumental construction across an entire civilization. Something was missing from the picture. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Cambridge University researcher Nicholas Evans and his team weren't searching for the cause of the Maya collapse when they began their investigation. They were studying ancient climate patterns, drilling sediment cores from the bottom of Lake Chichancanab in the Yucatan Peninsula. Lake sediments accumulate in chronological layers like geological pages in a book, and they contain chemical signatures that reveal what the climate was doing thousands of years ago. The methodology relied on analyzing oxygen and hydrogen isotopes preserved in the sediment layers. The ratios of these isotopes change predictably based on rainfall and evaporation patterns. By measuring isotope concentrations at different depths, the team could reconstruct a year-by-year record of how wet or dry the region had been across millennia. What they found rewrote the story of the Maya collapse. The data revealed that the Maya hadn't experienced a single drought during their decline. They had endured intermittent, prolonged droughts spanning 400 years, with the most severe periods coinciding precisely with the timeline of urban collapse. The numbers were brutal. During the worst stretches, annual rainfall in the Maya lowlands decreased by 41 to 54%. This is the kind of finding that changes everything. A civilization can survive a single bad year, even a few bad years in succession. What it cannot survive is a climate pattern that prevents food reserves from ever fully recovering between crises. Each drought depleted stored grain. Each wet period brought partial recovery, but never enough to rebuild the buffer needed to weather the next dry spell. Across generations, the Maya were running out of margin. And here's the part that should terrify any modern audience. The Maya didn't just experience drought passively. They actively contributed to creating it. Mayan farmers practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, the practice of clearing forest by cutting down trees and burning the remaining vegetation to enrich the soil with ash. To support an expanding urban population, they had to clear enormous quantities of forest year after year, generation after generation. Trees were also harvested for fuel, for construction materials, for the production of lime plaster used in their monumental architecture. The deforestation was staggering in scale. Modern climate scientists now understand that large-scale forest clearing produces measurable changes in local climate. Trees recycle moisture through transpiration, returning water vapor to the atmosphere where it can fall again as rain. Remove the trees, and you remove a critical part of the regional water cycle. Ground temperatures rise as direct sunlight bakes exposed earth. Rainfall patterns shift. The localized climate becomes hotter and drier. The Maya, in pursuit of feeding their growing cities, were systematically engineering the very drought that would eventually destroy them. The natural climate fluctuations were severe enough on their own. The human-caused intensification made them catastrophic. This was perhaps the first documented case in human history of a civilization triggering its own climate disaster. But drought and deforestation alone didn't bring down the cities. They created the conditions for collapse. What actually destroyed Maya civilization was how a deeply hierarchical God-king society responded when its rulers proved powerless to stop the gods from abandoning them. To understand why the Maya collapse cascaded so violently, you have to understand who Maya rulers actually were. The Ajahs, the local rulers of each Maya city, weren't merely political leaders the way modern governors or mayors are. They were divinely connected figures, intermediaries between the human world and the supernatural forces that governed everything from harvest yields to seasonal rains. Their legitimacy rested on a specific contract with the people they ruled. Keep the gods pleased, maintain cosmic balance, ensure the rains arrive on schedule and the crops mature without failure. In exchange, the population accepted enormous social hierarchy, paid tribute, performed labor for monumental construction, and participated in the elaborate religious ceremonies that defined Maya civic life. For centuries, this contract held. When droughts came, the Ajahs performed sacrifices. The rains eventually returned, and the system continued. But what happens when the rains stop returning? When the failures aren't temporary, but structural? The escalation in Maya religious practice during the late classical period suggests rulers and priests understood the stakes intimately. Human sacrifice intensified. The offerings grew more elaborate, more public, more desperate. The ritual mechanics were gruesome and theatrical by design. Victims were painted blue, the sacred color associated with the rain god Cha'ak. They were adorned with elaborate headdresses. 4 men held them down at the cardinal directions, representing the 4 corners of the cosmos. The heart was extracted while the victim was still living, and the body was often decapitated afterward. These ceremonies took place at the summits of pyramids, ensuring maximum visibility to both the gathered population and to the gods who were supposedly watching from above. The ball game served related religious functions. Eye-shaped courts have been discovered throughout the former Maya territories, with the largest, at Chichen Itza, exceeding the length of a modern football field. The game itself was demanding, requiring players to move a heavy rubber ball using only their right hip, right elbow, and right knee. But the religious significance went deeper than competition. Many historians believe losing teams or captured enemy rulers were ritually sacrificed at the conclusion of high-stakes games, transforming athletic competition into theological theater. When the rains failed repeatedly despite escalating sacrifices, an inevitable question began forming throughout Maya society. Why have the gods abandoned us? More dangerously, why are our rulers powerless to bring them back? This is where Maya religious belief became politically combustible. If the Ajahs were genuinely divine intermediaries, their failure to influence the gods could only mean one of 2 things. Either the gods had turned against the rulers themselves, or the rulers had never truly possessed the supernatural authority they claimed. Either interpretation was catastrophic for the existing political order. Some of the abandoned Maya cities may not have been destroyed by external invaders at all. The archaeological pattern of sudden artistic cessation, the disappearance of royal commemorative monuments, the targeted destruction of palace complexes, all of this is consistent with internal rebellion. Populations turning against their own ruling classes. The first to die in such uprisings would be the Ajahs and their immediate retainers, which would explain why commemorative artwork glorifying specific rulers stopped abruptly across the region. 9th century Maya texts mention conflicts between cities far more frequently than any earlier period in their recorded history. Archaeological panels depict captured enemies and list defeated rulers in numbers that suggest endemic warfare. As cities fought for diminishing resources, trade routes collapsed, supply networks fractured, and the economic basis of urban civilization disintegrated. The cascade was complete. Drought triggered famine. Famine destroyed legitimacy. Lost legitimacy triggered rebellion and warfare. War destroyed trade. Trade collapse accelerated urban abandonment. There's one part of the collapse story that has long puzzled researchers. While the southern Maya cities fell into ruin during the 9th and early 10th centuries, certain northern cities continued not just to survive, but to thrive. Chichen Itza and Uxmal, located in the northern Yucatan peninsula, kept building, kept ruling, kept producing art and inscriptions for roughly 150 years after their southern counterparts had been abandoned. The 10th century governor's palace at Uxmal stands as proof. This wasn't a city in decline. It was a wealthy power center constructing some of the most architecturally sophisticated buildings in Maya history, well after the southern collapse had run its course. Reliefs and inscriptions from this period depict scenes of warfare and human sacrifice, indicating Uxmal remained politically active and culturally vibrant, even as the broader Maya world was contracting around it. Then, in the 11th century, the second wave arrived. New constructions across the Puyallup region, including Uxmal itself, were left half-finished. The entire territory surrounding Uxmal was systematically depopulated. Chichen Itza followed shortly afterward, eventually falling into the same pattern of abandonment that had consumed the southern cities a century and a half earlier. Why did the North survive longer? The honest answer is that researchers still don't fully know. Possibly the northern Yucatan experienced less severe drought conditions for longer. Possibly the depopulation of the south meant northern cities could absorb refugees, supplies, and resources from a wider geographic area. Possibly the northern collapse was simply delayed rather than prevented. The the same systemic failures unfolding on a slower timeline. But here's the crucial reframe that changes how we should understand all of this. The Maya population didn't die, it dispersed. People left urban centers and returned to smaller agricultural communities scattered across the countryside, communities that could sustain themselves without the elaborate infrastructure, divine kings, and intensive monoculture farming that had defined classical Maya civilization. They rebuilt their lives at smaller scales. They preserved their languages, their agricultural knowledge, their religious traditions, their family lineages. Modern genetic studies have confirmed what the archaeological pattern suggested. Today's Maya populations carry direct genetic continuity with the people who built the classical cities. Same lineages, same mitochondrial DNA patterns, same chromosomal markers passed across 40 generations. The 30-plus distinct Maya languages still spoken today descend directly from the classical period tongues that filled marketplaces in Tikal and Palenque. Traditional agricultural techniques, jewelry-making methods, weaving patterns, religious customs blended over centuries with later Catholic influences, even ancestral surnames, all of it survived the collapse intact. When Spanish colonizers arrived in the 16th century, they didn't encounter an empty land or a vanished civilization. They encountered millions of Maya descendants living across the same territories their ancestors had inhabited for thousands of years. What followed was a different kind of catastrophe. Smallpox decimated populations that had no immunity. Forced conversion attempted to erase indigenous religious practice. Colonial labor systems extracted generations of Maya labor for Spanish profit. The cultural erasure that the Maya had survived during the classical collapse was now being inflicted deliberately by an outside force. The discrimination continues into the modern era in ways that are often violent. During Guatemala's 36-year civil war, which finally ended in 1996, victims of state-sponsored violence and massacre were disproportionately Maya. The descendants of the people who built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient Western Hemisphere are still fighting for basic recognition and protection in the countries they have inhabited continuously for 4,000 years. The civilization fell. The people refused to. The Mayans didn't predict their own collapse because there was nothing supernatural to predict. They engineered it themselves through deforestation, overpopulation, and ruling systems incapable of adapting when the climate they had altered turned against them. The collapse wasn't an event. It was a slow-motion cascade unfolding across 2 centuries. Drought triggered famine. Famine destroyed legitimacy. Lost legitimacy ignited rebellion and warfare. Trade networks fractured. Urban civilization disintegrated. But the truth that an ancient people warned us in lake sediments and abandoned murals exactly what happens when a society outgrows its environment matters more than any 2012 prophecy ever did. Somewhere in the Yucatan today, a farmer plants maize using techniques inherited across 4,000 years, speaking a language the temple builders spoke, carrying DNA the kings carried. The ruins are the empty shell. The bloodline is the real survivor. The Mayans never vanished. We just stopped looking for them.